Jovan Buha! Buha!
Yo, I'm Jovan Buha, Lakers beat writer for The Athletic, and welcome to episode 28 of Buha's Block. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing roster priorities for the Lakers, including certain positions and certain skill sets. We are going to be covering it all. But first, I want to take a quick look at the Lakers' projected depth chart entering the draft and free agency. So right now, the Lakers have only 8 players technically under contract. And from a depth chart perspective, it is Anthony Davis at center, Rui Hachimura at power forward, Jared Vanderbilt at small forward, Austin Reeves at shooting guard, Gabe Vincent at point guard, and then Christian Wood, Jalen Hood-Schifino, and Maxwell Lewis off the bench. Those are the 8 Lakers currently under contract. Now, there are 4 players who have player options for next season, including LeBron James, D'Angelo Russell, Cam Reddish, and Jackson Hayes. All 4 players must decide whether they're going to be opting in or opting out by June 29th. The Lakers also have the number 17 and 55 picks in the upcoming 2024 NBA draft on June 26th and 27th. So they could have as many as 14 players under contract entering free agency, or as few as 8, depending on what they do with the number 17 and 55 picks, as well as the decisions that LeBron, D'Lo, Cam, and Jackson make regarding their player options. So a lot in flux in terms of the Lakers roster and what it could look like entering free agency. Again, they could have as many as 14 players with only 1 empty roster spot for a Max Christie or a Taurean Prince or another player with their taxpayer mid-level exception. Or they could have as many as 7 spots open if all those guys opt out and they trade away their picks, or trade away the number 17 pick and then don't sign the number 55 pick to an official roster spot. So a wide range of what the roster could look like depending on what happens with some of these options and what happens with the draft. But for today's purposes, we're going to say that LeBron James is going to either opt in or opt out and resign. That is the way that the Lakers are operating, as if he will be back next season. All indications right now are that it's just a matter of contract length and whether LeBron would like to opt in and extend or opt out and resign. The Lakers are going to offer him whatever type of contract he wants, and the assumption is that he will most likely be back. So for now, we will slot LeBron James onto the depth chart, and that brings the Lakers to 9 players. So for the starting group, I will say AD, Rui, LeBron, Austin, and Gabe. I think Rui makes a little bit more sense in there. If you already have a 3-and-D guard in Gabe, you need a little bit more offense, I think, with that group. Although you could make the case for Vando, I will hear that case. I think it's close between Vando and Rui in terms of arguing who should be the starter. But if you're going a little bit more defensive minded, a little bit more of an off-ball guy with Gabe, I think you start Rui. I think it's close either way, but regardless, you're going to have one of those guys starting, one of those guys as a prominent forward off the bench. Then you have Christian Wood as the backup center. And then you have Jalen Hood-Schifino and Maxwell Lewis as the tentative backup backcourt. Though I think you're going to want some better players in there and to slot those guys more as 3rd or even 4th string guys, depending on how they develop this summer. So that is where the Lakers are currently at. Again, making a bit of an exception to add LeBron in. But those 9 guys, they clearly need some help in the backcourt, though that could come in the form of D'Angelo Russell opting in and the Lakers either trading him or keeping him until the trade deadline or even through the rest of the next season as a temporary option there. Could also come in the form of Max Christie re-signing. He's a restricted free agent, so the Lakers control his future. They will also either have the non-taxpayer or taxpayer MLE to potentially address the backcourt. Though I think if D'Lo opts in and they re-sign Max, they're close to set, especially if Jalen Hood-Schifino and or Maxwell Lewis can take a step this upcoming season and potentially become a back-end rotation player. But we shall see with that. Lakers also have the option to re-sign a guy like a Spencer Dinwiddie. So they have several options in the backcourt. I'm not as concerned with that as you guys will see with my roster priorities. And then, of course, they need upgrades on the wing and in the front court. So let's get into all of it. We're going to be going 1 to 5 in terms of biggest roster priority to smallest roster priority. To be clear, even the smallest roster priority is a roster priority. These are all positions and skill sets the Lakers need to address this offseason. They're going to be relatively limited with 3 first-round picks, some mid-sized contracts, the number 17 and 55 picks, and then the non-taxpayer or taxpayer mid-level exception, and then as many minimum contracts as they could fit on the roster depending on what it looks like. Somehow, with those resources and tools, they need to address some important roster needs. But that's the challenge of team building in 2024 with the new CBA and the first apron and the second apron and some of the restrictions that come with that. And with all that context, let's get into the biggest roster priority for the Lakers entering this offseason. Roster priority number 1 is a true 3-and-D wing, and ideally 2 or 3 of these types of players. In general, the Lakers have been lacking in two-way talent since the 2020-2021 season. That was the final season of Alex Caruso, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and Kyle Kuzma. Since then, the Lakers have had many one-way players on the perimeter. Most have trended more toward the offensive end. If you think about guys like Russell Westbrook, Lonnie Walker, Malik Monk, Kendrick Nunn, a lot of these smaller combo guards. But then you've also had situations where a guy like a Stanley Johnson or a Pat Beverly, guys who aren't plus offensive players, though they are plus defenders. So the Lakers have really struggled to find guys who can be pluses on both sides of the ball on the perimeter. Really have been lacking on the wings, though, in particular, where they've had to slot guys that are shooting guards up to the 3 and the 4, or it's been situations where a guy like a Taurean Prince, who's a plus shooter, but not a plus defender in the sense of like guarding the apex wings or an opponent's best perimeter scorer. And now he's slotted on some of these guys and it's a mismatch. So the Lakers have really struggled to fill this position over the last few years. It is arguably the toughest position to fill in the league outside of like a top 10 player. And the Lakers have one of those, if not a couple of them, in LeBron and AD. So they've checked that box, but they need more two-way talent, particularly talking about at least one guy in that like 6'7" to 6'9" range that can defend multiple positions and shoot at least 34-35% on threes, space the floor, be a credible threat. So if we're looking at the roster, it's kind of like if you combined Rui Hachimura and Jared Vanderbilt. I think both guys right now, like Rui to me is like a 1.5 way player, clearly a plus on the offensive end despite his struggles in the Denver series. But defensively, we saw some of his limitations in that series, chasing a guy like Michael Porter Jr. around the perimeter, around screens. His screen navigation and hanging with quicker guys on the perimeter is a bit of a struggle for Rui. That's why defensively, he's more of like a 4.5. We've seen him bang with bigger players in the post in terms of a Nikola Jokic or a Karl Anthony Towns. Like he's got the stout, powerful base to handle those guys on the post or in the elbows. And one-on-one, he's held up largely defensively. Like Jokic is going to score on anybody. He scored on Anthony Davis. He scored on Rudy Gobert. He scored on Rui. So like one-on-one, you don't really want to put him on an island against Jokic. But Jokic and Embiid, those guys are exceptions. But for the most part, Rui's been able to hold up against bigger centers in the post. It's just been some of the perimeter assignments that he's had that have been where he's fell short a bit. And then a guy like Vando, I look at as more of like a 1.25 player. Like clearly defensively, he's elite. He's one of the better perimeter defenders in the league. I think with a full healthy season and a proper role, he would be an all defense candidate, probably more of like an all defense second team guy, but clearly one of the elite perimeter defenders in the league, can defend 1 through 3 and probably even 1 through 4, maybe even 1 through 5, depending on the opponent and depending on the lineup. But can switch. His screen navigation off the ball is one of his few defensive weaknesses, but he's got the size, he's got the length, he's got the athleticism. He could pressure and hound the ball. He can navigate screens on the ball, and he can rotate, he can switch, he can help on the back line with his rebounding and his secondary rim protection. So Vando checks most of the boxes defensively, but it's the offensive end where he is a below average, to put it kindly, offensive player and shooter. He's one of the worst gravity guys in the league in terms of teams are just going to ignore him really wherever he is on the floor, but especially if he's spotting up, teams are not going to pay attention to him. They're going to pack the paint against the Lakers. And you've seen the consequence of that with some lineups with Vando struggling offensively just because of how teams are guarding him, or rather not guarding him. Now, the Lakers started to figure out some creative ways to use him as an off-ball screener and DHO guy and as a cutter over the 2 to 3 weeks before he got injured. So I think the next head coach, whoever that ends up being, should look at some of that film. And if the Lakers end up keeping Vando this summer, look at some of that film, look at some of the success that they had last season with him having double-digit performances and just as a cutter and a screener, DHO guy, etc. Like some of the creative ways to use him and to use the way that defenses guard him against them. And if the Lakers can do that, I think Vando nudges up more toward like a 1.5 or 1.75 player and is much more playable and can take on a larger role, potentially even the starting role in like a 30 plus minute a night capacity. But as long as he is in his current form offensively, and we'll see if how much of what happened before his injury was real versus a fluke. He is to me more of like a 1.25, 1.5 at most player, kind of similar to Rui. So the Lakers need a two-way guy. The Lakers need a guy who you cannot ignore offensively. He's going to make you pay offensively if you don't pay him attention. He doesn't necessarily need to be like a star level scorer. Those guys are tough to find, and there might only be one that's realistically available. But defensively, he needs to be able to defend multiple positions, needs to be able to take on the primary assignments. It's not going to be LeBron. It's not going to be Austin. Like there needs to be a clear step up from those two defensively in terms of the on-ball assignments. But then also with some level of size and athleticism and length, some level of defensive rebounding, some level of just energy and effort. And then offensively can be a catch and shoot, spot up guy, hit threes at a reasonable rate, be able to attack a closeout and keep the ball moving and just fit within the offense and be like the number 4 or number 5 behind LeBron, AD, Austin, and then potentially Gabe or whoever else is in that starting group in the backcourt. Again, these guys are expensive either in free agency or on the trade market. They are hard to acquire. Every team wants as many of these guys as possible. You look at the Celtics and the Thunder and the Clippers, everyone is trying to build their roster like that with multiple guys between 6'6" to 6'9" that could switch across different positions, play positionless basketball, and do multiple things offensively. So those guys are hard to find. But I have a list here of guys who could be available either in free agency or on the trade market. I think the ideal guy is Mikal Bridges. I think it's probably unrealistic. The reported prices for him have been sky high, multiple first-round picks. Remember, the Nets turned down 4 first-round picks for him. I believe it was last summer. So they're very high on Mikal Bridges. They seem to be overvaluing a lot of their players. They also turned down an offer of 2 first-round picks for Dorian Finney-Smith from an unknown suitor previously as well. So the Nets, it's been difficult to trade with the Nets clearly. But Mikal Bridges would check basically all these boxes. If anything, he's overqualified for that role. And if anything, he could step in and be a true number 3 behind LeBron and AD and share some of that offensive responsibility with Austin Reeves. But that's probably unrealistic. So looking at some guys that could be available via trade, Jeremy Grant, Kyle Kuzma, DeAndre Hunter. Those are 3 names I mentioned in a recent mailbag. Those are 3 guys on teams that are either in a rebuilding phase and are willing to trade guys for the right price, or in Hunter's case, the Hawks are going through a shakeup right now and trying to trade and reshape their roster. So seems like those 3 guys, and obviously I think Grant and Kuzma are at a different level than DeAndre Hunter, especially when you look at his contract. But all 3 guys could check those boxes to some extent. I think Grant and Kuzma are not quite at the level defensively that you want them to be, but they make up for that with their frames of being 6'9", 6'10", being decent to solid rebounders, and really more leveraging their length and athleticism defensively rather than being like technical, like all defense caliber guys. DeAndre Hunter fits the profile a little bit more as like a traditional 3-and-D wing, and he's a better shooter historically than Grant and Kuzma, though Grant has shot well the last couple of years. All three guys rate out about even defensively in terms of defensive EPM, estimated plus minus. That is a stat that basically determines your impact. All three guys actually rate as slightly below average defenders on that metric. So all three do trend more toward the offensive end. There's also the matter of Kuzma and Grant having to assimilate to smaller offensive roles. They're going to be at best the number 3 option, but probably battling Austin Reeves for the number 3 spot offensively. So those two guys in particular would have to buy in to being in smaller roles, going from being like number 1s and number 2s with their current respective teams to taking a step back or even a couple steps back. For Kuzma, there's also the familiarity and the history with the Lakers and how he would feel about sort of spreading his wings in Washington and then coming back and having to do some of the same things he did in LA previously, be more of a role player and how he would feel about that. Another more attainable name is probably Dorian Finney-Smith, who the Lakers have had interest in previously. He is in that 37 to 40% three-point range. He is a plus defender who could defend multiple positions. I've said it on this podcast before. I thought he did as well as anyone last year defending LeBron James. If you go back and rewatch that Lakers-Nets game, and I believe it was late January where the Nets upset the Lakers. It was one of the Lakers' worst losses of the season. But Dorian Finney-Smith did not have a good shooting game, and some people that were against trading for him were looking like, hey, look, he didn't shoot well, was missing open shots, and that's a fair criticism. But defensively, I thought he did as well of a job battling with LeBron in the post, hanging with him on drives, and absorbing his strength and physicality as just about anyone. And, Aaron Gordon, I think, is in a different class as a defender, but Aaron Gordon is also much more expensive. And, so I would say Aaron Gordon is the best LeBron defender, I think, in the NBA right now. But Aaron Gordon aside, I thought Dorian Finney-Smith did as well of a job as anyone I saw last season and might be the best and most realistic candidate among this group. Then looking at some of the guys in free agency, there is Derrick Jones Jr., which would likely be for the non-taxpayer MLE. There is Kelly Oubre Jr., Royce O'Neal, Caleb Martin, Patrick Williams, who's a restricted free agent, Nicholas Batum, Robert Covington, Obi Toppin, Hayward Highsmith, Isaac Okoro, Najee Marshall. So we're starting to get into some of the lesser names, and some of those guys would be, I think, more taxpayer MLE guys, like 5.2 million rather than the 12.9. But those are just some of the names that I think most of those guys are plus defenders. Most of those guys are in that 6'6" to 6'8" range. Gary Harris is another one, though he's on the smaller side, more of like a 3-and-D shooting guard, doesn't have the size to necessarily scale up. And then, certain guy like Nicholas Batum is on the older side. Robert Covington, for whatever reason, has basically been in cobwebs for the last few years. Obi Toppin, I think defensively has some concern, like kind of is similar to Rui to me, like more athletic, more explosive for sure, and might be a better and more consistent offensive player at a really good shooting year. But defensively, I thought the Celtics and the Knicks were able to target him and take him off the dribble. Haywood Highsmith, I think, is a name, though he's 6'5". Najee Marshall was buried behind better players in New Orleans. Isaac Okoro, interesting name, though he's also on the smaller side. Kelly Oubre, I think, is a little bit too shot happy. Royce O'Neal sounds like Phoenix wants to try and keep him. Caleb Martin's also on the smaller side, though I think he would check some of these boxes. Patrick Williams is an interesting one. Has a bit of an injury history. Also worth mentioning, DeAndre Hunter has a extensive injury history as well. But Patrick Williams, I actually think is a sneaky, might be my favorite among this group if he's available for that non-taxpayer MLE. But this is the position that I think the Lakers need to address the most. Like ideally, you could add a couple of these guys and maybe split the non-taxpayer mid-level exception with a couple of them, or maybe you trade for one and then you sign one with the non-taxpayer mid-level exception. But I think LA needs at least 2 of these types of guys, not necessarily this exact list, though I do like most of the names on this list. But if they could add a couple of those guys and then keep a Max Christie and maybe he's the third guy, and maybe Vando, maybe they keep Vando as well out of trades and he takes a step offensively. Now all of a sudden, with Vando and Christie and a couple of these guys, you have the outlines of a more modern roster. You have better two-way lineups that make a little bit more sense against the Celtics and the Clippers and the Thunder and some of these teams with armies of wings and two-way wings that can score and also defend multiple positions. So I think that roster construction makes more sense. I think the Lakers are just in general bereft of two-way talent, and they need to acquire as much of it as they can, and that should be the top priority this offseason. Roster priority number 2 is contingent on D'Angelo Russell not being on the roster, and it is the D'Lo replacement. And the D'Lo replacement could go a variety of ways. So I have a list here of potential guys, but this is either D'Angelo Russell opting out and signing with another team, or opting out and being signed and traded, or him opting in and then the Lakers trading him. So any of those situations where he is not on the roster, the Lakers are going to need another point guard on the roster. Could be a starting level guy, could be a backup, could be a star, right? And maybe D'Lo gets packaged in a deal for a third all-star level guy. But regardless of how it ends up where he's not on the roster, if he's not on the roster, the Lakers will need some form of replacement. I don't think they're going to get by with just Austin Reeves, Gabe Vincent, and Jalen Hood-Schifino. I don't think that is a good enough point guard position. I don't think that is a good enough trio in the backcourt. I think you need at least one more ball handler, one more guy in there. So on the top end, we have Donovan Mitchell, Trae Young, Darius Garland, and DeJounte Murray. Those are the 4 all-star level guys that are potentially available depending on what happens in Cleveland and Atlanta. There's still a lack of clarity in terms of what's going to happen with Donovan Mitchell and his contract extension, which Atlanta guard Atlanta is going to choose to keep, which one they're going to choose to trade. And then if Donovan Mitchell ends up extending and staying in Cleveland, which seems to be the way that this is trending, what happens with Darius Garland? Do they keep those two together and continue to try and figure it out? Or does Darius Garland ask out? And now you have a young all-star level point guard on the trade market who is represented by Clutch Sports with the clear ties to LeBron James and Anthony Davis. So that's like the top end of trading for the third star. And as I've reported and said recently on here, I've heard recently that the Lakers are looking more toward upgrading the supporting cast rather than adding a third star. And again, we don't even know which one of these stars is going to be available necessarily. Looking at some medium options, so guys that I think the Lakers could either trade for or use their non-taxpayer mid-level exception for Tyus Jones, DeAnthony Melton, and Malcolm Brogdon. Brogdon would have to be a trade. He's currently with the Blazers. But Tyus Jones, to me, his ideal use is a high-end backup point guard. Like we're talking about a top 2 or 3 backup point guard in the league. To me, he's not quite a starter. He can be a spot starter, but I think if the Lakers just added him and still had Gabe and Austin, I would start Gabe and Austin and have Tyus come off the bench. DeAnthony Melton is more of a 3-and-D off guard in the mold of like an Alex Caruso or a Pat Beverly without the antics. He can defend either backcourt spot and is a solid shooter. And then Brogdon has the pedigree, the experience, the size, and is a plus offensive player. Defensively, kind of depends on the assignment. I don't think you want him as the primary backcourt guy, but still a solid player. And then looking at some cheaper options, be it either vet minimum or taxpayer MLE guys, Chris Paul, Kyle Lowry, Chris Dunn, and Monte Morris. So not the most inspiring list right now, but these are all guys that, again, if the Lakers end up losing D'Lo, I think you do need to replace him with another ball handler, and could also be a guy in the draft at number 17. If you know D'Lo is going to opt out, or you know he's got a deal in place, maybe you do draft another point guard at 17, and that's the guy that ends up being the backup if they can outplay Jalen Hood-Schifino. But I think point guard replacement is important if D'Angelo Russell is no longer on the team. I think you can up the usage and ball handling responsibility and playmaking responsibility with Austin Reeves. You could also do some of that with Gabe Vincent. You're still going to have LeBron, but you will need that backup. You could also go the 3-star route, right? And completely remake your roster and completely remake your offense. But whether it's going that route or whether it's adding more of a backup guy, I think the Lakers are going to need to add one more backcourt player, and that's of priority if D'Angelo Russell is gone and all of a sudden there's a bit of a void there. If he stays or the Lakers end up trading him for another guard, obviously you go in a different direction. Which brings us to roster priority number 3, which for me is a quality backup big man. So similar to roster priority number 1, a 3-and-D wing, the Lakers have really struggled with the backup big position over the last few years, cycling through DeAndre Jordan, a third stint of Dwight Howard, Damian Jones, Wenyen Gabriel, Tristan Thompson, Thomas Bryant, who had some good stretches, but was basically a stretch 5 and could not provide much defensively. And then this past year with Christian Wood, who, in my opinion, was disappointing. 7 points, 5 rebounds a game, shot 31% on threes, had some good defensive moments early in the season, but never stepped up quite the way that the Lakers wanted when Anthony Davis was out, or even when he was the primary big on the floor and AD was off. Always looked better next to LeBron and AD and couldn't really carry units by himself the way that the Lakers had hoped he could, based on his prior numbers in his previous stops. And then Jackson Hayes had some nice moments, especially in the second half of the season. But as we saw in the Denver series, did not play well in that series. The coaching staff did not trust him in that series. And though I think the Lakers could have benefited from playing slightly bigger lineups and going to more Jackson and AD in that series just for the rebounding and the rim pressure and the rim protection, they decided not to do that. And I think Jackson Hayes, maybe he opts out and earns a little bit more money. Maybe there's someone out there willing to pay him the taxpayer MLE or the biannual exception. I thought Jackson Hayes had a solid second half of the year. That second half stretch was maybe the best we've seen from any of these guys over the last few years, but this has been a hole for the Lakers since the 2020-2021 season. So championship year, you got JaVale, you got Dwight, you got AD who could play the 5. You could even go a little bit smaller with LeBron or Markieff Morris at the 5. 2020-2021, you got Marc Gasol, Andre Drummond, Montrezl Harrell, AD, of course, and LeBron. And then since then, it's been a lot of LeBron and Rui at the 5, not trusting the backup centers and those guys really just not being rotation caliber guys come playoff time. So I think the Lakers need at least one rotation caliber big off the bench. And this is one that's going to be relatively hard to trade for. I think there's sneakily a lot of competition for these types of guys. You look at Denver not having a good backup center behind Nikola Jokic, Oklahoma City not having a good backup center behind Chet Holmgren. The Clippers could be in the market for a new backup with Daniel Tice and Mason Plumlee hitting free agency. New Orleans could be in the market for both a new starting and backup center. Really, no team in the West right now is happy with their center rotation, and there's going to be a lot of competition for these guys on the trade market and in free agency. This list is not very sexy, I will be honest, but top option, I don't really have one. I don't know who the top option is. I don't see one out there. Like, I guess Miles Turner would have been the top option for the Lakers, but I think after making the conference finals, Indiana is going to be keeping that core together and looking to improve it, if anything. So I think the Miles Turner ship has sailed, though that is the exact type of guy I think would be perfect for the Lakers. And that would be one roster construction in which I'd be okay with going back to the 2 bigs and sliding LeBron down to the 3, and then having more of those 3-and-D guys come off the bench, or maybe you start one and slide Austin down and you go with Austin and LeBron as the primary ball handlers. But outside of that, looking at Andre Drummond, Jonas Valanciunas, on the cheaper side, Xavier Tillman, Daniel Tice, Jalen Smith, James Wiseman. Do the Lakers take a flyer on him? Day'Ron Sharpe out of Brooklyn. Like, it's not the sexiest list right now. I don't think any of those guys are necessarily changing the Lakers season. I think Drummond and Valanciunas would be clear upgrades over Wood. Tillman, Tice, Smith, Wiseman, Sharpe, those guys, it's less clear. I think it depends on how they are utilized. Among the group, I'm most intrigued by Tillman, Sharpe, and Tice. I think Tice has been a really underrated center. He's old and he's undersized, but I think he's been really solid. I think he was solid for the Clippers and just a solid backup. Tillman, I've liked for years, not as a starter, but more as a backup role. He is also somewhat undersized, but I think he can give you solid 15 to 20 minutes. And then I think Sharpe is someone who has a lot of potential and has been underutilized in Brooklyn. So again, those guys are all probably more minimum or taxpayer MLE, or maybe you're splitting the non-taxpayer MLE with one of those guys, plus one of the aforementioned wings. But I think the Lakers need to upgrade this position. I think they need to invest in it. And if they are making a trade, maybe trading for a big. It's probably not going to be a Miles Turner, but could you get a Wendell Carter? I've seen that floated out by Trevor Lane of Lakers Nation, who, by the way, will be on the show this week. I've listened to you guys. You guys have been requesting him, and he will be my next guest. But, could you get someone like that? Otherwise, there aren't a lot of teams out there looking to trade centers. If anything, again, teams are trying to bolster their size with Jokic and Embiid and the Minnesota bigs and now Dallas's bigs and Boston having Porzingis and Horford. Like, you need good centers, and the Lakers have a great center in Anthony Davis, but he needs a quality backup. I think the Lakers need to invest more in this position. I think they need to take it more seriously from a roster building perspective. I don't think the answer is likely going to be a minimum guy, but if it is going to be a minimum guy, I think it needs to be more of an energy, physicality big rather than a name or, a former all-star or a guy on their last legs. Like, it needs to be someone who's going to bring a level of grit and tenacity and physicality and force rather than some of the more offensive-minded guys that they've signed and guys who have been defensive liabilities. And if D'Lo's on the roster or the Lakers trade him for another guard, I think this becomes the number 2 priority. And then the guard upgrade slides to the bottom of this list. But for now, I will have the backup center spot as the number 3 priority. Roster priority number 4 is 3-point shooting. And with D'Angelo Russell, potentially a free agent, and with Taurean Prince being a free agent, those are 2 of the Lakers' top 4 shooters from a percentage standpoint and 2 of the Lakers' top 3 shooters from a volume perspective. So if the Lakers lose both D'Angelo Russell and Taurean Prince, they're going to need to replace those guys. So to look at it last year, the Lakers were 8th in 3-point percentage, but they were 28th in 3-point volume. I've said many times on here, I think they need a coach who is going to prioritize threes more. I think they need to be closer to league average from a volume perspective. Percentage, obviously great. You ought to be top 10. 8th is an awesome figure, and they were even higher over the second half of the season as their offense ascended to the number 2 offense over that stretch. But they need to be taking more threes. They need better 3-point shooters. They need high volume 3-point shooters. So this is where it gets a little tricky, because if you're trying to prioritize a 3-and-D wing who's going to trend a bit more on the defensive side, and you are trying to get a better backup big, that only leaves so many resources to find another shooter or 2. So looking at it, of course, D'Angelo Russell and Taurean Prince, if you can keep one of those 2 guys, I think that partly addresses this. But looking at a Gary Trent Jr., who is kind of a 3-and-D wing, I think is a little bit lacking on the defensive side and is also on the smaller side, more of like a shooting guard than a true like 3 or 3.5. Klay Thompson, of course, so that's going to cost you at least your non-taxpayer mid-level exception, although I'm sure he'll get offers more than that. A Buddy Hield, though that will also cost you your full non-taxpayer mid-level exception. On the cheaper side, and Alec Burks could be a vet minimum guy or a taxpayer MLE guy. Kyle Lowry is a plus 3-point shooter. If you bring him in as a backup point guard, you're checking a couple boxes there. Gary Harris, though again, he's on the smaller side in terms of like a 3-and-D wing. Obi Toppin shot 40% this past season. Haywood Highsmith, another guy who shot around 40%. So Malik Beasley, Lakers could bring him back, not as a defensive stopper like Milwaukee used him, but as a plus shooter. So I think this one is rather straightforward of just like Lakers probably need another high level shooter. And again, in some of these cases, Clay's an interesting one in terms of like a 3-and-D wing. That was basically what he was. He was the highest level of 3-and-D wing as a Golden State Warrior. Could obviously do more than that offensively, but that was the way he was used, is essentially JJ Redick offensively, much higher level, but then defensively was guarding 1 through 3 and taking on those primary assignments. It sounds like his market's going to be higher than the non-taxpayer MLE. Maybe he's willing to take a discount to play for his hometown team, but I haven't heard that. I doubt that. And then some of these other guys like Buddy Hield comes with some defensive concerns. Kyle Lowry is on his last legs. He's a point guard. Alec Burks comes with some defensive. Like Alec Burks is a sneaky one. I wouldn't mind. The Lakers have had some interest in him in the past. Gary Harris on the smaller side. Haywood Highsmith also on the smaller side. So like none of these guys like check like again, you're going to have to give something up. You're going to have to be willing to not address something. I do think the shooting is important in a 2024 landscape where threes, again, I referenced it previously, like threes have sometimes dictated the games, just literally who takes more threes. And the Boston Celtics have been a great example of that, where it's basically been, do they take more threes or not than their opponents? And that determines who wins the game. So it's not that simple. That is a bit reductive, but it is very important in 2024 to have quality shooters, to have quality spacing, and to have high volume shooters and be a more modern offense. And I think the Lakers adding one or two of these guys, or maybe trading for a guy, it is of utmost importance, especially if they do potentially lose D'Angelo Russell and Taurean Prince. I think you need to be adding guys who can fill in some of those spots. Taurean shot 40% on about 5 attempts per game. D'Lo was 41% on over 7 attempts per game. So that's a lot of volume and high percentage volume that the Lakers would be losing and would need to replace. So 3-point shooting, whether it's with the 3-and-D wing, whether it's maybe with one of the bigs or one of the backup guards, Lakers need to be adding 3-point shooting to this core and have proper spacing around LeBron James and Anthony Davis. And finally, roster priority number 5 is bench scoring. And I think this was exposed in the Denver series, where outside of Taurean Prince, no one can make a shot off the bench for the Lakers. They didn't have Christian Wood. They didn't have Jared Vanderbilt. So they didn't have their full complement of players. But Gabe Vincent really struggled in that series. Spencer Dinwiddie really struggled in that series. Jackson Hayes struggled in that series. And Rui Hachimura, who could potentially be moved to the bench next season, depending on how the Lakers build out the roster, also really struggled in that series. So the Lakers needed more pop off the bench. As JJ Redick and LeBron James have talked about on the Mind the Game podcast, you need at least 7 to 8 guys who are solid rotation players. And the Lakers really struggled with their bench in that series. So this also speaks to just bench talent in general. But looking at the 2022-23 season, they had Lonnie Walker, who helped swing a game in the Golden State series. They had Rui Hachimura coming off the bench until he eventually started in the Denver series. They had Dennis Schroeder coming off the bench, providing a spark plug. So I think the Lakers need to find those types of spark plug guys. I think scoring is a part of it. Energy is another part of it as well. But having that wild card off the bench, the Lonnie Walker, the Malik Monk, the Kyle Kuzma during the championship year, like the guy who could just come in, get hot, get you 15, 20 points and help swing a quarter or a half or a game. Like the Lakers did not really have that at the end of this past season. So I think adding one of those types of guys, and it could just be more scoring in general, just more reliable shot making and shot creation. Of course, adding a third star would check this box and would reshape the structure of the team. But looking at some of the guys, I think DeMar DeRozan and Klay Thompson are above this level. Those guys would come in and be starters. If either one of those guys were willing to come in and accept the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, you can move other players to the bench. You can move Gabe Vincent to the bench, and maybe he becomes that guy off the bench, similar to his role in Miami. Gary Trent Jr., Buddy Hield, Alec Burks, Obi Toppin, Kelly Oubre. Some of those guys are going to want to start. Some of those guys would start. But bringing in some more wild cards offensively, I'm sure there are some minimum guys that the Lakers could identify. But just that one guy that can get hot and swing a game could be Spencer Dinwiddie if he is empowered and feels more acclimated and is more aggressive and confident offensively. But having one of these types of guys, I think, off the bench, like the Lakers really missed that type of, again, Schroeder, Lonnie Walker, Malik Monk, Kuzma, the championship year, even THT had some flashes of that. So like that type of guy, I think you probably only need one. I don't think you need a bunch of gunners and guys looking for their own shots, but you occasionally need that guy when the offense is stalling, when one of your stars is having an off night, then that guy can come in and pick up some of the loads. The Lakers didn't really have that last year, and I think they could benefit from having that type of guy. So to recap, number 1, a 3-and-D wing, and ideally 2 to 3 of those. Number 2, a D'Lo replacement, be it a third star or a high-level backup. Number 3, a quality backup big. Number 4, more 3-point shooting. And number 5, more bench scoring, more of a wild card. And if D'Lo's on the roster or the Lakers end up trading him for another starting level or high level backup, I would take that backup guard position off this list entirely or slot it at number 5. Maybe you want one more ball handler. Like I look at a potential Mitchell trade of he's more of a shooting guard. You'd probably want another point guard on the roster, but I think that becomes a little less of a priority, filling in more the wing position, the backup big position, and more shooting, and then a wild card off the bench. So these are my 5 priorities for the Lakers entering the offseason. These are priorities I've talked about with people within the organization, people around the league. But for those watching on YouTube, let me know in the comment section if I missed anything, if you would reorder these priorities. I'm sure there will be people who view the big man position as more important or less important, people who view shooting as more important or less important, maybe someone who views the backup point guard position or the starting point guard position as a bit more important than I have it here. But to me, I think it's difficult to argue against the 3-and-D wing being like that third front court spot. To me is just vital for the Lakers, and it's been something they've really struggled with since that 2020-2021 season. But that will do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching and listening. For those on YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and drop a like and a comment if you enjoyed this episode. For those on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your podcast platform of choice, be sure to download, follow, and leave a 5-star review if you enjoyed this podcast, you enjoyed this episode. I'll be back on Friday with Trevor Lane and episode 29. I'll talk to you then.